So most people that you will ask will probably tell you that Leon is their favorite Resident Evil character. But for me, Chris has always been my favorite video game character for as long as I could remember. He's appeared in more games than any other character of the franchise, and he's gone through more shit than the rest of the characters as well. From losing his team multiple times to his iconic rivalry with the big bad of the series, Albert Wesker, Chris's journey across all Resident Evil media has been a long and hard one. So on this episode of Nerdspace Games, we take a look at every version of Chris Redfield that we've seen over the past 28 years, as I give you guys the best renditions of him throughout the games and even the movies. So my name is Ruben with Nerdspace Games, and this is my top 10 best versions of Chris Redfield. Let's get it. Number 10, Resident Evil Revelations.
Where'd you go? Jill.
Revelations is one of 3 non-numbered entries of the RE video game franchise that's also considered a mainline entry. Taking place before the events of Resident Evil 5, Revelations follows a handful of protagonists, which includes the 2 protagonists of the first game, Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine. Honestly speaking, this game is more so Jill's game versus a Chris game. However, Chris gets a few opportunities to showcase why he's the main character of the video game universe. Chris manages to take on a pack of wolves while being injured, defeat one of the biggest monsters of the franchise, and even assist Jill with taking down a teleporting tyrant. The only reason this version of Chris doesn't make his way any higher on today's list comes down to 2 reasons. 1, him being on the sidelines for most of the game, and 2, the fact that his character in Resident Evil Revelations has little to no character development throughout the game compared to what we normally see from him in other entries of the franchise. Number 9, Welcome to Raccoon City.
What's Vickers doing here? Thought we lost the chopper with the rest of the budget cuts. Maybe he just missed us.
I know a lot of people are not big fans of the newest live-action Resident Evil film, but personally, I actually enjoyed it more than the other live-action Resident Evil movies. But even if you were not a fan of Welcome to Raccoon City, there's at least one thing that I'm sure we can all agree on. Robbie Amell was near perfect casting for Chris Redfield. Seriously, this guy was spot on. His delivery, his look, everything. Sure, lore-wise, they didn't exactly deliver on his character as much as I would have wanted them to, especially with the decision to make him not as close to Claire as he was in the video games, but hey, they did ultimately get that sibling bond established by the end of the movie. Overall, the Redfields were probably the best parts of Welcome to Raccoon City, and while I wasn't a big fan of everything that this movie decided to do, I am totally fine with Robbie Amell reprising his role as Chris Redfield in a future live-action movie. Like maybe a Code Veronica movie, ? Number 8, Resident Evil 7.
I'm Redfield. I'm glad we found you.
Easily one of the most controversial changes made to a character within the Resident Evil franchise, the Chris Redfield in Resident Evil 7 looks vastly different compared to every other version of him. As explained by Capcom, this was mainly due to the studio wanting to use the new RE engine for Chris in a way that made him have a slightly more realistic face with better facial expressions. However, the change in the way he looked in RE7 was met with harsh criticism. And while I definitely agreed with the new look being a massive disappointment from a character side of things, RE7's version of Chris Redfield wasn't all that bad. In fact, he still had traits about him that reminded us of the Chris that we fell in love with all those years ago. Granted, most of this can only be seen in the Not a Hero DLC, thanks to Chris only appearing in the final moments of the main game and the End of Zoe DLC. The Chris in Resident Evil 7 showed us a soldier fighting against BOWs to save innocent lives, like the Winters family, and even risking his own life to save his fellow comrades. Unfortunately, as always with Chris Redfield, he fails to save most of his team, and he's forced to watch people he cares about meet a grim fate. This Chris clearly has been affected by the tragedies that he's faced throughout his long war against BOWs, but not to the extent that we've seen in Resident Evil 6 and Resident Evil Village. He still has some of that optimistic viewpoint, and he still feels like the hero of the franchise, despite what the name of his DLC in RE7 might hint towards. Number 7, Resident Evil Death Island.
There was this guy named Piers. I wanted him to take over after me. I trusted him, and he trusted me. He fought alongside me, then he died to save me.
Even though Capcom has confirmed that Chris Redfield is the main character of the video game universe, the same thing can't be said about the CGI movies. Clearly, when it comes to those films, Leon is Capcom's golden boy. Still, Chris has appeared in 2 separate CGI movies, including the most recent film that sort of became the Avengers team-up movie for the Resident Evil universe. In Death Island, Chris's character mirrored the version of him that we saw in the later half of RE6's campaign. After losing Pierce, it seemed like Chris returned to his old self of wanting to do everything he can to protect the world from BOWs. In this movie, we see him team up with other main characters of the franchise while battling a new virus set inside the infamous Alcatraz prison. One of my favorite moments of this movie is when Chris is talking to Jill about what they've been through and how they need to move forward, and he mentions Pierce, his ex-partner that sacrificed himself to save Chris. Unfortunately, this version of Chris can't move any higher up on this list due to Chris being kind of sidelined in Death Island. Like with multiple characters in this movie with the exception of Jill and maybe Leon, most of the other main characters in Death Island seem to be included in the movie just to get that famous Avengers scene that we saw in the trailer. Number 6, Resident Evil Code Veronica.
You get out of here, Claire.
But what about?
As a surviving member of STARS, I have to finish this.
Remember your promise.
I'll end this once and for all. Say hello to my comrades who you've killed.
I don't know where you get your confidence, Chris.
I really like to call this version of Chris Redfield Big Brother Chris. The first half of the game follows his sister Claire Redfield as she searches for information on Chris on Rockford Island. After being captured by Alexia Ashford in Umbrella's Antarctic base, Chris arrives on Rockford Island as he begins to follow in Claire's footsteps in hopes of rescuing her. Honestly speaking, there were a few changes to this character that I didn't fully agree with. He somehow looked younger in this game than he did in the original Nightmare. Plus, in some of the ways he delivered his lines in Code Veronica, he sort of sounded Canadian, which obviously is not where the Redfields are from.
Sorry to disappoint you, but Alexia is gone. I'm sorry, Claire, but it's not over yet.
However, the pros definitely outweigh the cons in this version of Chris as we get to see the bond that he shares with his sister, Claire. His willingness to travel across the globe in order to save his sister demonstrates what kind of brother Chris really is. On top of that, we get to see the rivalry of Chris and Wesker build up in this entry, as Code Veronica is the first time that Chris and Wesker have seen each other since the events of Resident Evil. Their rivalry was one of the best parts of this game, and seeing how angry Chris has become over time towards Wesker for killing their comrades perfectly sets up Resident Evil 5. In fact, it's exactly why I want to see a Code Veronica remake before we get a Resident Evil 5 remake. Number 5, Resident Evil Vendetta.
You just had to try to save her. You're so predictable, Chris. That's your weakness.
My favorite Resident Evil movie is the CGI film Vendetta. And honestly, a big reason for that comes from the fact that Chris Redfield is front and center and the guy is an absolute badass in this movie. Ironically, Leon and Chris have kind of switched roles compared to their Resident Evil 6 counterparts. Whereas Chris was the one that was tired of his long war with the BOWs in Resident Evil 6 and Vendetta, it was actually Leon that was like that. And whereas Leon was the one that helped bring back Chris from his broken self in Resident Evil 6, this time it was Chris that brought Leon back. Similar to past movies and games with Chris, we follow him as we once again watch him lose his entire team and people close to him. Just like with Resident Evil 6, we see Chris give into revenge as he becomes obsessed with tracking down the man responsible for his team's death, Arius. Realizing how difficult the task is alone, Chris enlists the help of Raccoon City survivors Leon and Rebecca. In this movie, we see Chris get plenty of time to shine as he finds himself in some of the coolest fight sequences seen in the Resident Evil franchise. After watching what Leon did for him in Resident Evil 6, it was actually really awesome to see Chris take that role on for Leon to help guide him back to the war against BOWs. And unlike Death Island, Chris was actually front and center this time around instead of being sidelined throughout most of the film. Number 4, Resident Evil Village.
What have you done?
He's gone! I tried. He stayed so we could all escape. I'm sorry.
Honestly, I went back and forth about where to put this entry of Chris Redfield, but I ultimately settled for number 4 on this list. Originally, I wanted to go lower because there are a couple of things that I don't really love about this version of Chris. For example, his decision making throughout the game is definitely not at its best, and he makes multiple mistakes that I wouldn't expect from someone with his experience. With that being said, there are some really interesting and unique qualities brought to the table with this version of Chris compared to other versions of him. And Capcom realized their mistake in RE7 in terms of the way he looked, as they went back to a more recognizable look for our boy. Also, this Chris Redfield is the oldest that we've seen in the franchise, and it kind of shows. We finally get to see a Chris that's worn down from all the fighting that he has done throughout the years against BOWs, and with the exception of Resident Evil 6, this version of him sort of illustrates the level of the psychological impact that the war has had on him. At the same time, we see the caring and relatable Chris that we've seen in the past. He's someone that builds bonds with everybody that he meets, and ultimately it hits him hard after failing to save someone. In this scenario, we see Chris's emotional reaction to losing Ethan Winters. So despite not making the best decisions throughout the game, and despite not being front and center like he is with other entries of the franchise, Village gives us a new look at a character that has been around since the start of the franchise. Number 3, Resident Evil.
Enrico! Don't come any closer, Chris. What happened? Double crosser. Enrico, wait. Enrico! Umbrella. Enrico! Double crosser.
If it makes you feel better, then you can include both the original Resident Evil and its 2002 remake for this spot, but personally I feel like Chris shines more in the remake than he does in the original game. First off, the 2002 remake of Resident Evil takes a more serious approach with each of the characters compared to the original version of the game. While the original dialogue was without a doubt more iconic and memorable thanks to how cheesy they were, the 2002 remake gave characters like Chris Redfield a unique personality. Keep in mind that Chris Redfield has yet to face all of the tragedies that await him in his future. So because of that, we get to see a more down-to-earth Chris who's still a bit naive, but always willing to do whatever it takes to save his comrades. His relationship with his fellow STARS members is one of the things that made him so relatable in the 2002 remake. In fact, even when he's off screen, other characters close to Chris like Barry make comments regarding how important he is to them. And characters like Jill and Rebecca are immediately drawn to him and trust him with their lives. We see a more passionate Chris than we have seen in other entries of the series as he continues to lose his fellow STARS members, like when he loses Richard and Enrico. Number 2, Resident Evil 6.
Pierce! No, don't do this!
Open the door!
God damn it! Listen to me! We can still both get out of here! There's still time! What are you doing? No, Pierce, don't! You can still make it out! God damn it, Pierce!
No! Pierce, open the goddamn door! That's an order!
Arguably, this entry may very well be the most controversial decision I've made on today's list. Listen, I'm probably the biggest advocate of hating on Resident Evil 6, I really am. Just look at my rankings of the entire franchise. And I know that for a lot of people, Chris comes off as annoying, frustrating, and even out of character compared to his earlier entries of the series. But for me, I have to disagree with that point of view. Whenever you take a look at the history of Chris Redfield, we see a character that has been fighting BOWs and Umbrella for as long as he can remember. During that war, Chris has lost more people than you can imagine. In the original game, he lost almost his entire STARS team, people that he worked with and people that he trusted. In Resident Evil Code Veronica, he failed to save Claire's friend, Steve. While he didn't know Steve personally, he knew how much Steve meant to Claire. And prior to the events of Resident Evil 5, he thought he lost his best friend, Jill Valentine. And he failed to save people in that game too, including a squad getting killed by Irving and his pilot friend, Kirk. So when RE6 comes around, the guy has been through hell and back already. So when he loses another team of his, including the soldier Finn that trusted Chris to protect him, it breaks him. And this, my friends, we finally get to see the psychological impact of the losses that Chris has had to face throughout his entire career. From getting amnesia to then being driven by revenge, Chris becomes a completely different character. We get to see a darker and more vengeful Chris as he sacrifices everything to chase after the person he blames for the death of his fallen comrades. Ultimately though, we get one of the best redemption arcs I've seen in the franchise. Over time, thanks to the help of Pierce and Leon, Chris is able to recover from the losses, and he finds that heroic side of him that we all remember. And even after losing Pierce, he doesn't give into grief, as he reminds himself that Pierce wanted him to carry on and to protect others from the BOW threats, which is something that we continue to see from Chris in future games. Overall, the Chris in RE6 is the most real version of him that we got, thanks to the game focusing on the wear and tear of his mind and body after facing everything that he has faced up until this point. For that, I can't think of a better reason than to put Resident Evil 6 at number 2 on this list. Number 1, Resident Evil 5. It's seriously impossible to think of a better version of Chris Redfield than Resident Evil 5's very own boulder punching hero. Sure, Chris Redfield definitely hit the gym pretty hard before making his ultimate comeback in Resident Evil 5. But to be fair, Chris has gone through more character changes than any other character of the franchise. I mean, just look at every version of Chris that we've seen in video games that appear on this list alone. Still, seeing Chris bulk up like this out of nowhere definitely presented a ton of rumors and questions regarding how he managed to get so ripped in between Resident Evil games. And it didn't help that he punched a boulder later in this game either. Regardless, physique aside, Chris Redfield is at his best in this game. Here in Resident Evil 5, we find Chris to be a combination of different versions that we've seen from him in the past. We have vengeful Chris Redfield, who's looking to take down Albert Wesker once and for all. We see a heroic side of him, as he's willing to go through heaven and hell to save not one but both of his partners, Sheva and Jill. We see Chris at his strongest, as he's able to pull off things that most of us wouldn't even dream of being able to do. I love Resident Evil 1 Remake Chris Redfield. I even love RE6 Chris Redfield. However, if I was to sit down and choose my favorite version of him that captured my favorite parts of him throughout the entire franchise, then I feel like RE5's Chris Redfield would be the perfect rendition of this character. Perhaps that's why I like this version of Chris so much. It's the perfect balance of every rendition of him that we've seen over the years. Not too naive, not too dark, not too over the top with his heroics, and a very relatable yet vengeful hero that's just an all-around badass. And again, Chris punching a giant fucking boulder is a bonus. But that's it for this episode of Nerd Space Games. Hit up the comments and let me know what you think of my list. Is Resident Evil 5's Chris Redfield the best version of that character, or is there another version of Chris that you think deserves that title? Let me know down below. Also, let me know if there's any version of Chris that I didn't include in my top 10 that you think deserves a spot in today's list. I know there's a few I missed, like the Umbrella Chronicles Chris and the Anderson Films version of him in Afterlife, so be sure to let me know your opinions on that as well. Anyway, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to my channel for more survival horror content. Also, leave a like on today's video if you enjoyed today's topic. But thanks for watching, and as always, I'll catch you guys on the next episode of Nerd Space Games. Take care.